Hi there. I'm still on break, but I can't stop myself from writing scripts, so blame my workaholic self for that. Here's a highly requested video, the so-called economic calculation problem. Now, this is something that really is a non-issue, and most people that invoke the ECP know very little of the details of the nearly century-long now discussion revolving around it. They just read some libertarian Reddit post or something that told them it somehow destroys socialism, when all it does is show the limited creativity of those that defend capitalism. Regardless, let's hop right in and see what all the noise is about. This is of course timestamped, so feel free to jump around if you'd like. Chapter 1. What is the ECP? Now, the ECP really refers to two separate so-called problems, the knowledge problem and the economic calculation problem proper. I personally see little point in separating the two, as the solutions to both are intertwined, but I want to give you all the facts. The basic overview was given by von Mises and built upon further by Hayek. The argument goes as follows. Rational economic decision-making is not possible without price signals provided by genuinely competitive markets based on private ownership of the means of production and investment on the basis of profit maximization. Note the word rational. Now, the smart ones amongst you almost immediately see that this is a statement on platitudes and assumptions, not reality. In fact, it's a statement so endowed with ideology as to make Zizek blush. All the basic assumptions are provably wrong, and that'll be shown soon. The question basically goes, how could planners, be they all of society democratically contributing to a collective plan, or a more limited top-bottom and bottom-up highway between enterprise councils and a central planning authority, decide how to coordinate production? What to produce, how much, at what stage, with which raw materials, how many raw materials, at the most efficient level, etc., etc. All this information needs to be gathered, calculated, parsed, and redistributed to the relevant centers of allocation and production at all levels of the economy. Mises' answer is a boring one. It isn't possible for them to do so, hence the market remains. A side note being that this doesn't argue against socialism per se, but more against planning. There are advocates for market socialism, for example, of which I am not one of them, and I'll discuss this in a bit as well. Mises' general claims that there's no possible way we can gather, process, and communicate all the data in real time across the whole economy in a way that would reflect the complexity, particularly in regards to supply and demand. Seems they never grow out of that phase. Since it can't be done by planning, as apparently it will cause so many errors in production as to bring the whole economy down, it must be left up to the market. In fact, he implies socialism is impossible because of this so-called fact of nature. He further claims that every aspect of production, from the cost of all inputs at all times to the locations of inputs and products and changing demands and tastes of purchasers, is encompassed by price. Hayek's formation of the calculation problem is, in my opinion, much stronger. He retreated from the impossibility argument and instead stated that socialism could possibly calculate rational prices, hence breaking with Mises, but he questioned the practicality of it doing so, implying superior efficiency through the market, so the core of the argument really doesn't change. There is more nuance to this, as with all things, and that'll be touched on shortly. But, Chapter 1.5. Why even bother discussing this? In my opinion, the discussion of the problem is pointless because the vast majority of the people that bring up the ECP line aren't trained economists or even knowledgeable in the field, but a bunch of people who've learned a catchphrase they think is heavier than it really is. Anyone even moderately knowledgeable about what they're talking about would know that this really isn't as damning of a critique as it's made out to be in some places. This doesn't mean the discussion shouldn't take place, though. You should just be a little strategic with the way you go about it. Point out the ignorance in a calm and cordial way, and don't give in to the flawed presuppositions of the argument. For one, we'd have to agree on what rational economic management is. Cut through the propaganda and you'll see that to them, rational only seems to mean what serves the desires of investors and shareholders. To socialists, rational implies meeting needs regardless of profitability. Researching novel treatment for rare diseases is rarely, if ever, profitable, yet it is still a rational thing to do, just not to Mises, Hayek, and their disappointing adoptees. Secondly, we're operating on two different definitions of efficiency. To the pro-market side, they mean profit maximization. They try to dress it up in all sorts of rosy language, but in the end it all boils down to what makes the most money regardless of utility, as they rely on the flawed assumption that whatever is profitable is useful, /increases general well-being, /improves society, /meets a need, and so on. Even with that said, only the smart ones will get far enough to admit this. To socialists, on the other hand, efficiency is measured according to need first. How many calories? How many housing units? How many roads or hospitals or schools, etc.? Furthermore, the entire argument, and Mises' conception in particular, hinges on a world of horse-drawn carriages and a lack of instant communications. His arguments fall apart when we take into account satellites, the internet, and modern computing. By the 1940s, the theoretical responses to Mises, Hayek and co. in relation to the ECP solved this non-issue, especially in relation to consumer goods. By the 50s, Kantorovich proved that you can carry out rational economic planning and optimize production without money. Lange, Davidson, Cockshott, and dozens more have further contributed to this very long and very tired discussion at this point. So, just remember, this is an ideological argument, not one based on the facts, a learned catchphrase like so many others. With that said, though, let's continue on to Chapter 2, the failures of the market. To the disappointment of the people who invoke the ECP, markets, prices, and everything else related in the real world don't exactly work how the argument presupposes. The economist Robin Hanel argued that markets are actually systematically inefficient because externalities are pervasive and because real-world markets are rarely truly competitive or in equilibrium. For all this discussion of supply and demand, ideal and rational prices, self-regulation, etc., important realities are sidestepped. Like, for example, manipulation of supply through arbitrary pricing or market and supply manipulation, hoarding, lobbying, or manipulation of demand, brands as status symbols, psychological targeting for artificial demand, simulated peer pressure, unethical consumer targeting, like for example through children, or through collusion, or one-sided buyouts, or planned obsolescence, or monopolized sourcing, or. The simple matter of the fact is, these idealized, uniformly competitive markets found in textbooks don't exist in reality. Real markets don't conform to those models, are limited and manipulated both internally and externally, and are at a stage of capitalist development in which truly free and fully competitive markets are not only impossible, but also highly undesirable to capitalists and their lackeys. With that said, though, let's start simply. Supposedly, the market is the most efficient mechanism for the allocation of resources. If that really is the case, though, why have they done such a shit job of it all? Boom and bust cycles, the associated severe recessions that drown countless millions into poverty, destroying whole economies in the process. All of this happens due to mismatches between required inputs and produced outputs. I thought prices and market mechanisms were supposed to prevent such gross mismatches. If the market remains so efficient, why is it that when these disastrous failures happen, capitalism isn't saved by market mechanisms, but by government bailouts and pump priming? Legitimately, if the market was really as great as it's painted out to be, why is it that practically all of developed capitalism has been crawling along economic stagnation since the Great Recession? Growth of inequalities unparalleled, stagnant wages, the crumbling of infrastructure, hell, even climate change. How is it that the all-knowing and all-efficient market hasn't solved any of these issues, and practically everything that benefits the general populace over the profits of a few are so dependent on state financing and public sector efforts? But government meddling! Blah blah, it's the same tired argument over and over. The basic economics theory that as long as enterprises are free of state interference, markets would suddenly make everything as productive and efficient as can be, and all for the public good too. But this vision greatly overstates the role of markets. Aptly put by Cockshott, even in so-called market economies, markets of the sort described in economics textbooks are the exception restricted to specialist areas like the world oil and currency markets. The main industrial structure of an economy depends on a complex interlinked system of regular producer-consumer relationships in which the same suppliers make regular deliveries to the same customers week in and week out. Markets are anything but rational at allocating resources if we're being honest, and the claim of price signals being the shining star that guides the Magi to Bethlehem is equally, well, let's just say putting too much faith in the idea. Price signals are good at indicating where profit can be made so that industry is mobilized. But profitability, if we're being generous, is only tangentially linked to society's well-being. They can claim all they like that the only way to profit is to solve the needs or wants of the consumer, but that is demonstrably not true. Firstly, this depends on you being a consumer in the first place, meaning you have to spend money to even get a look from this benevolent system. Even with that said, there are many ways to profit while neglecting or harming consumers, at all levels. People starving in the wealthiest country on earth is an example of this. Homeless people next to people's homes. Do I need to yet again, for example, mention climate change, where rather than mobilizing to reduce carbon emissions and improve our collective situation, companies would rather bribe and lie their way out of regulations and limitations on their businesses. Simply put, the supposed efficiency and quote-unquote rationality of the market is little more than a meme, and a bad one at that, especially when it's all built on a lie, since you have Chapter 3, Planning under Capitalism. Why yes, planning, as expansive, if not even more expansive than ever occurred under the USSR, takes place every single day in practically every firm under capitalism. Of course, in between firms, companies operate on a market, but internally there is no market. Strange, as the market purists want you, and imperial perfect countries they extend criminal loans to believe that markets are the solution to everything, at every time, everywhere. In reality, which sadly doesn't exist within those basic economics textbooks we're always told to consult, there is no internal market in large, well-functioning companies. The different departments, stores, trucks, and suppliers do not compete against each other in a market. Everything is actually coordinated. Walmart and Amazon are excellent examples of this phenomenon. These are no small economies either. Walmart's revenue is to the tune of around $500 billion, a little over half that of the USSR's GDP in the 70s. The comparison can't really be made accurately in this case, but it's just to give you an idea of the scale we're working with. But hold on, the knowledge problem of Mises, in which there are far too many calculations to make and far too many inputs and outputs to keep track of, doesn't seem to be affecting Walmart or Amazon in the slightest. Well, simply, that's because he was wrong, or more appropriately, was limited by the period in history he was writing in. The exact details would make this video longer than it already is, so I'll leave the appropriate book recommendations at the end of the video for those interested.
But the complexity of Walmart versus an entire economy are two different things. Modern-day firms are islands of planning in a sea of market mechanisms, so you're still wrong, somehow.
These grievances aren't particularly incorrect, just more misplaced. Walmart, Amazon, and dozens of other massive companies are at the forefront of developing both supply networks as well as algorithms and software for maximizing their efficiency towards their final end, profit. This is a fine experiment, both in theory and in practice, of the tools that socialism can use towards the ends of a humane and truly rational economic model. Ironically, this really does reflect Marx's words, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers." This isn't even mentioning the historic presence of planning in supposed capitalist success stories, such as South Korea and Japan. Planning is done all the time under capitalism. The only difference is, who's the planning done for? Chapter 4. Planning under Socialism and Supposed Inefficiencies. Historically, planning was practiced in several countries. First and foremost amongst these is the USSR, the country that began as a backward land of peasants, devoid of industrial production, that within 3 decades became a modern nuclear superpower that conquered the cosmos. Now, this should go without saying, but modern planning will look very, very different than what it looked like in the USSR on account of our radically different conditions and levels of technology. For most of its existence, the USSR only planned a small group of inputs, around 10,000 out of an economy of over 10 million outputs, by hand. All of this in light of constant international vilification, sabotage both internal and external, military threat, diplomatic isolation, economic sanctioning, on and on. The very fact that they managed to achieve what they did with these constraints is nothing less than impressive. With that said, though, the supposed inefficiency of planning, particularly Soviet planning, is the main criticism aimed at socialism even to this day. Some of the honest criticisms have their place, while a lot of them are kinda in the vein of shooting somebody in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk afterwards. Let's be fully clear. There were clear deficiencies of Soviet-era planning, some a result of their conditions, a lot more that they could have changed by their own hand, but didn't. It's outside the scope of this video to discuss this in depth, but we can briefly touch on it for now. The claim goes that, due to the sheer scale of bureaucratic task involved with planning a major economy, inefficiencies occur and the market is a superior option. This is explored by Cockshot when he says,
"If there are hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of distinct products, no central planning authority could hope to keep track of them all. Instead, they were forced to set gross targets for the outputs of different industries. For some industries, like gas or electric power, this was not a problem. Electricity and gas are undifferentiated. A kilowatt is a kilowatt, no argument. But when you turn to consumer goods, clothes for example, the range of products was too big and targets were set in terms of monetary output. The plan would specify a growth in the value of output clothing, furniture, etc. What this translated to then depended on the price structure. By resulting to monetary targets, the socialist economies were already conceding part of Mises's argument. They were resorting to the monetary calculation that he had declared to be vital to any economic rationality, but empirical evidence for the greater macroeconomic efficiency of markets, even when compared to classical Soviet planning, is on much thinner ground. As Allen, 2003, shows, the only capitalist economy whose long-term growth rate exceeded that of the USSR was Japan, whose own model was some way from unplanned capitalism. Compared to other countries starting out at the same economic level in the 1920s, the USSR grew considerably faster.
It's not all doom and gloom for historic planning, though. In the early 90s, Morel, not a socialist by any regard, published an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives reviewing empirical studies of efficiency in the socialist planned economies. The results? Virtually all of them found that by standard neoclassical measures of efficiency, the planned economies performed as well or better than market economies. Of the 18 studies he reviewed concerning technical efficiency of firms and standardizing their methodologies, he got the following results. A 90% level of technical efficiency in capitalist firms, a level of 93% in Soviet firms, in another 84% versus 86%, in another 87% versus 95%, and so on, practically identical. Furthermore, to the disappointment of those that decry the supposed soft budget constraints of socialist economies, meaning since the socialist state had an interest in having firms succeed, those same firms have technically no hard budget limit, and somehow this leads to inefficiencies. The reality is that socialist economies had a pretty high level of allocative efficiency, which is the degree to which inputs are allocated among firms in a way that maximizes the total output. His research found that, even at 100% allocative efficiency of inputs, Soviet outputs would grow only by a meager 2%. Hilariously, in my research for this video, I found strange justifications for these sort of results from the pro-market side. Basically,
oh yeah, Soviet planned economy was as efficient, if not more efficient at allocating resources, but that's because they didn't have technological innovation. Only the market can do that.
Rarely do I see such concentrated cope. The fallacies of the above pro-market statements should be self-evident, so we'll move on. Building up from this point, another mistakenly held belief is that prices within planned economies were arbitrarily set exchange ratios without any relation to the relative scarcities or economic values of inputs. The idea being that only the market can set prices close to equilibrium levels. This, too, is complete nonsense. Erich Dietzenbacher and Hans-Jürgen Wagner studied the phenomenon in comparing East and West German data, and found that the divergence from so-called optimal neoclassical prices to be identical between the two countries, 16.1% and 16.5%. Simply, the USSR and other planned socialist countries, despite having flawed systems of planning that nonetheless relied on a form of price signaling, still performed fairly well. That's not to say that their system of planning should be repeated, but it can be taken as an example to be studied and learned from. Furthermore, history has shown that planned economies, even with their historical shortcomings, prove Mises and Hayek's criticisms to be generally unfounded. Chapter 5. The Future of Planning in Light of the Past. The fundamental assumptions behind the ECP is what is mistaken. What do markets do under capitalism? They are mechanisms for capital to reproduce itself. This behavior is rational in that it has a rationale, but it doesn't make it desirable for social ends. The point of socialist economics isn't to replicate this, but to break the rule of capital altogether. The point isn't to beat the market at its own game, but to simply create a truly rational mechanism for the production and distribution of goods. Now that's all well and good for historic planning, but socialist planning in the future should look different, right? Well, you're exactly right. The core of Mises' argument is that prices and costs are the best way to compare between alternative forms of making things, and to arrive at that which is most efficient. Mises seems to miss the possibility of a socialist economy setting internal prices, not as an expression of market value, but as an expression of alternative options in order to move resources between enterprises. With enough data and enough math, you can calculate your way to efficient prices. But even that is unnecessary. The modern argument, which has its roots as early as the 1930s, is to use labor time as an alternative to prices, something Mises himself conceded. Furthermore, with modern computing, it wouldn't be too difficult to maintain up-to-date figures for the labor costs of each input to the production process.
But labor values have limitations.
Yes, but so do prices. Any scalar measure will have limitations as production is a multifactorial process. As previously mentioned, this issue has been solved nearly a century ago at this point. Kantorovich developed a form of in-kind calculation, meaning a non-monetary form of meeting the general constraints of production on top of labor time. No need for prices, and efficient too. It was never applied in the USSR due to the limitations of technology at the time, but by the 1990s, the story changed. What this means is that, since the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR, all of the criticisms of Mises and Hayek and co. have more or less no place anymore in the discussion. The exact details of modern planning is outside the scope of this video, but do take a look at Cockshot's excellent Towards a New Socialism, in which he lays out a lot of the how and why, with empirical evidence. Don't worry, more book recommendations are to come, as always. Look, the knowledge problem isn't a problem anymore. The
rational allocation
problem isn't a problem anymore.
The pearl clutching, but no price signals
problem isn't a problem anymore. I'd argue most of these weren't even problems to begin with. Our future goal is to develop systems of wide and all-encompassing democratic participation between enterprises and planning committees, and vice versa. Countless ideas exist, and all that's missing is some software and a bit of organization. Capitalism truly does create its gravediggers. Chapter 6. The Failure of Argumentum ad ECPum. In this section, we can touch on how the ECP fails on several fronts as an argument against socialism. If you particularly hate yourself, this Cato Institute article really lays out all the tired claims of this argument. At first, they claim Mises' critique of the ECP has never been debunked. I assume they haven't done any of the reading, because this is just not true. There isn't even just one debunking of it, by the way, there are several. They then go on to repeat the price nonsense, the idea that prices are somehow better descriptors of behavior in an economy, which is patently false, as we've already discussed. Economist Joan Robinson argued that many prices in modern capitalism are effectively administered prices, created by quasi-monopolies, which challenges the connection between capital markets and the so-called
rational resource allocation
that happens in a market. But that's beside the point, though. Prices, too, lose fidelity because they cannot contain and transmit all the information necessary for the relative material circumstances, as well as describe the overall costs or benefits of certain actions. Prices are only good enough for maximizing profits. Prices won't tell you the impact of greenhouse gases on the environment, nor will they take into account inability to access private healthcare. These two are costs and information relevant to society, yet prices don't give a damn. This of course ties back into the idea of so-called rational planning and how pro-market and socialist voices view what exactly is rational differently. Polluting a river because it's cheaper than properly taking care of waste is rational to the pro-market side, while providing a rural mountainous community with healthcare, despite it being wildly unprofitable, is rational to the socialists.
But that's why government interference exists.
But we're no longer in the textbook
uniformly competitive
market picture in that case. Also, that statement betrays the truth that even the most pro-market pundits know, that markets aren't all that efficient when it comes to stuff other than maximizing profits. The ideology game is fickle, you see. They go on to meme about,
without prices, there is no effective way to allocate resources at a societal level in service of consumers.
Again, they don't see the fundamental failing that is serving consumers. Meaning whatever is profitable. Again, capitalism has shortages all the time, you just don't see them unless you're poor. Also, the aforementioned research earlier in the video has shown this to be also false. They go on to waffle about Walmart and Amazon not being valid examples for socialism in the book, The People's Republic of Walmart, despite not having read the book, it seems, as the book's entire argument is, and I quote, "All of this hints at how economic planning on a massive scale is being realized in practice with the assistance of technological advance, even as the wrangling of its infinites of data, according to Mises and his co-thinkers in the calculation debate, are supposed to be impossible to overcome. The foundational stones are being laid. It doesn't matter if there's only intra-firm planning currently under capitalism. According to neoclassical nonsense, this already is heresy. The market is supposed to be the best at everything. The failed experiments of Sears and other companies in having intra-firm market competition failed, and failed spectacularly. The book goes into this in great detail. Planning within a single firm can grow into planning of all society, so their limp dismissal of the book and its arguments really comes across as nothing more than an ineffective coping mechanism. They go on to state that planning is inefficient, in the example of the USSR, which has already been discussed and shown to be false. Then they trip on their own claims of that supposed inefficiency by saying the USSR invented and innovated pretty well, actually, but just
didn't have the institutional arrangements to turn inventions into marketable or consumer products.
Yes, that's apparently an argument. The entire rest of the article can be summarized as, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. Basically, fuck it and do whatever you like business-wise, it'll magically benefit society on a whole. We've seen how well that train of thought has worked out in the current climate catastrophe. Little more than ideology clouding rational thought, a favorite pastime of these types. Another strange claim I see floating around is the idea that saying computers generally help in solving this ECP non-issue is somehow incorrect. Basically, the same claim of the market being more efficient, quote-unquote, let's play the what exactly does efficiency mean though game again. That planning would have to exponentially expand and develop ever superior AI to even meet the basic form of the market, let alone surpass it. What this misses is that the aim isn't to beat the market at efficiency, no matter how you define efficiency. The market is garbage at that already. Even by profit maximization standards, planned economies did a decent job at that too. That's beside the point though. The point is to do a good enough job so that production is maximized in a rational way, so that all base needs of the population are met. We're not aiming to create markets by circuits and silicon. We don't need to replicate the market with computers. Our aim is to replace it altogether.
But a planned economy will have no freedom, and no right to property, and no...
blah blah, same tired arguments you've heard a million times already. There's no freedom under capitalism when you have to sell your labor power to survive, and private property, meaning that which is used for the expansion of capital, as Marx said, has already been done away with for 9/10 of the population. How many stats on global inequality and how half of the Earth's wealth is in the hands of like 10 people do you need to see before the truth hits you? On a side note, why do these types defend billionaires so much? The economists are on a payroll, so I get their grift, but some dude sitting in Arkansas behind a monitor, honestly, why?
But the USSR fell apart.
Which they exclaim without knowing the first thing about Soviet economic planning, political structure, or social organization. The first experiment of socialism on a large scale achieved amazing feats even with all the hurdles in its way. That's not what I would consider a failure, especially given that it was the first ever attempt. I think the pro-capitalist economist Brian Kaplan said it fairly well. The collapse of communism has led Austrians to loudly proclaim that Mises was right. However, current events do nothing to show that economic calculation was the insuperable difficulty of socialist economies. There is no natural experiment of a socialist economy that suffered solely from its lack of economic calculation. Thus, economic history, as well as pure economic theory, fails to establish that the economic calculation problem was ever a severe challenge for socialism. Honestly, there are so many problems with this argument that I barely scratch the surface. Deeper critiques get a lot more mathematical and boring, so I've omitted them, but you're more than free to check out the further reading section at the end of the video if you're interested. Pretty much every objection raised, both common and obscure, is covered by the many sources and PDFs I link. If you're to read only a single one, though, I recommend it be Cottrell and Cockshot's Calculation, Complexity, and Planning, the Socialist Calculation Debate once again. All of this can be found in the pinned comment. Chapter 7. Market Socialism as a Solution? For those who have read further into this topic, you'd definitely be aware of the many market socialist models that have been developed over the years. From Alec Nove's work to Lange's models, there are several market-dependent socialist setups that exist that claim to meet the critique of Mises, Hayek, and co. to differing extents. I personally am of the opinion that market solutions, be they so-called socialist or not, aren't solutions at all. This video is long enough though, so I'll bullet point my arguments here. Markets can only provide information on individuals and their market engagement. Markets are incapable of providing meaningful information about the social effect of said private market engagement. Markets rely on investment relative to other investments to measure productivity. Investment decisions require long-run estimates of collective needs, but prices reflect only present data. Investment is limited on a temporal basis by the short-sightedness of market decisions. To quote McNally, how is the market to regulate decisions with respect to public goods, which will, at least in large measure, be consumed by the next generation? If market regulation does exist and relies on prices in the wider sense, meaning planning prices as in terms on which alternatives are offered, there is no reason why such planning prices couldn't be determined without resorting to market regulation. Private, small-scale markets in either only consumer goods or solely so-called luxury goods have a place in the argument, as Cockshott and McNally state. If we're going to have collective state directives to such a deep level, though, why even have markets at all? There's a lot more to this, but honestly, I'm supposed to be on break, so I can't bring myself to extend this video another 5 minutes for this point. Do forgive my laziness here, but take a look at the further reading. Conclusion. Today, we have scratched the surface of possibly one of the most boring and pointless discussions on socialism over the past century. Historic planning had its issues, further planning most likely will as well. But anything is better than the reckless anarchy of the market that implodes on itself every couple of years, only to risk humanity's survival further, be it through climate change, the collapse of social and economic structures threatening war, or even boring things like the implicit inability of markets to meet the actual needs of people. Our future in planning won't take form overnight, nor will it be easy, but it will be necessary. Most importantly of all, though, it's definitely doable. I have some recommended reading for you, as always, and this includes The People's Republic of Walmart by Phillips and Rosworski, a decent introductory book into the topic, generally, but it reproduces some of the usual anti-Soviet remarks, especially when commenting on the early economic discussions within the USSR. It seems you can't get published without them. The rest of the work is decent, though. Then we have McNally's Against the Market, which too is decent. He's a trot, though, and doesn't let you forget it, but his arguments, particularly against market socialist variants, are pretty good. Finally, I had the pleasure of recommending Cockshott's new book, How the World Works, which is an absolute masterpiece of a book. Incredibly ambitious, I might even say over-ambitious. It touches on so many points so beautifully that I'm actually telling you to go and read it right now. The second half of the book, directly relating to socialist economy, is indispensable. Go, right now. Finally, Towards the New Socialism, also by Cockshott. I've recommended this like 3,000 times now, and if you haven't read it, then honestly, I don't know what you're doing, but in your spare time, go and give it a read. It's easy to read, it's very entertaining, and it answers so many questions. It's a great book, honestly. And that's that, finally. If you like what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Pan-Semitic Communist, Daniel Sack, Person, Sexy Socialist, Joshua B. Everidge, Carl Mailing, Noah Abbas, Victor Cease, Skrill? I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right. Christopher Rush, Claudia Lanzetta, Mick H., Travis Nell, King Harless, Silver Wilt, Lennon. I was not expecting that. Yeah, Lennon. Keaton, Ash, Oscar G., Amina, Tristan, Tyler Shore, Goblin. May you live in interesting times. That is a Chinese curse. Kevin Terranova, Tillmensch, and Jack Emanuel. Thanks for watching.